Okay, let's see. Lawrence, how about leading us in prayer this morning, please, sir?
Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity we have to gather here to study your word. We know it'll bless us. We're so thankful for the rain because we need it so bad. We pray that you'll be with us now during this Bible class and later on in the worship service and help us to concentrate on what is being said and taught, and so that our lives may be affected by it. Thank you for loving us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Okay, there we go. We are in Numbers 21. Now, I knew, see, I was just waiting. I knew that. Numbers 21 is where we're going to start. Aaron has passed away. Miriam has passed away. The only one remaining of that generation is Moses, and his death will wait till the end of the second book. But the new generation is taking over, and they have replaced the old generation. Almost all of them have died out. And so the new generation faces their own challenges. 21 starts with a very brief, it's only 3 verses long, when the spies had gone into the promised land and brought back a discouraging report, and God had sentenced them to the wandering. They tried then to go in and invade the land and attack the Canaanites, even though God told them not to. And they got defeated pretty soundly. Well, this time the shoe's on the other foot. Notice how it starts. Numbers 21:1. The king of Arad, the Canaanite, who dwelt in the house in the south, heard that Israel was coming on the road to Atharim. Then he fought against Israel and took some of them prisoners. So the war is actually, the battle is started by the Canaanites. Israel makes a vow to the Lord and said, if you will indeed deliver this people into my hand, then I will utterly destroy their cities. And the Lord listened to the voice of Israel, delivered up the Canaanites, and they utterly destroyed them and their cities. So the name of that place was called Hormah, which means destroyed, or utter destruction. Now that's a really brief account of their first of many victories. From this point on, Israel is, for the most part, going to be victorious. And I say for the most part because there's going to be one little wrinkle in that when we get just a little bit further. Yes, sir.
What portion of the promised land is Canaan?
Well, actually, the Canaanites are on the outside of the promised land proper. Okay? Okay, here's my air map. Thanks for remembering my air map. Here's the Dead Sea. Now, the land of Edom is south of the Dead Sea and to the east. Israel had tried to go through Edom. They'd been refused. So they have to go south, probably all the way back down to the, whatever sea that is right there. It's called the Gulf of Aqaba. But anyway, it seems they went all the way down to a port city on that coast and then turned to go north up the east side of Edom. And so somewhere in this region, we're dealing with the Canaanites. I'm trying to remember exactly where it was. The problem with that is trying to define and understand exactly where it is. But this should have been on when they turned to go north, heading up toward, somebody read my air map here and tell me what this is. Anyway, they're heading toward Moab, Midian, and Amalek. But they're all on the east side of the Jordan River. So their first conquests are actually not in the promised land proper. And the reason I say that is because the promised land was supposed to start at the Jordan River and go west all the way to the Mediterranean. These first victories are on the east side of the Jordan River. They're still destroying nations that God had condemned, but this will be the land inherited by 2.5 of the tribes. So they actually get more than what was originally promised to Abraham. So they're on the east side of the Jordan River, and by the time we get to the end of chapter 20, well, probably by the end of this chapter, they're up pretty close by that point to the Jordan River, and straight across the Jordan River to the west will be Jericho. So we're heading toward the staging area for their entrance into the Promised Land. How's that? See? Ma'am? Ammon, you mean? No, that's where they'll wind up. That's up at the top of the Dead Sea, but on the east side. We're not quite to Ammon yet. The Canaanites are in this, on the way to reaching Ammon, however you pronounce that. But I have a better map in one of my other Bibles. I didn't bring it. I should have copied it for you. Can you do that? I don't know if you can run. You've got it on your phone. That's just, okay, that's all right. Okay. But again, that's a very short account. What is getting kicked off here is the change in Israel, because now she is becoming increasingly victorious against her enemies. Before this, she really didn't have a lot of victories to celebrate. From this point on, almost all of it is victories. Almost. Now, we've got a new generation. What did the old generation do every time things got a little bit rough? They complained, right? And they generally took the complaint and accused Moses as well as God. So that was the old generation's way of life. Chapter 21, verse 4. They journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom, and the soul of the people became very discouraged, or impatient, depending on your translation, became very discouraged on the way. And the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? Now, wait a minute. Isn't this a new generation? Didn't they learn from the old generation, David? You're right. They have heard it. Okay. That's good. I like that. But hopefully you learn a little bit, right? Well, they didn't. Although I will give them credit for one thing. Just a second. It says, still back in verse 5. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? Now, God's been sustaining them for 40 years and hasn't let them die yet. But accusation's still there. There is no food and no water. Is that true? Is there no food? Why do you say that, Barbara? He's fed them all the way through. They've not died yet. That's right. And of course, then they get to this. Our soul loathes this worthless bread. Now, that's a slap right there. So the Lord sent fiery serpents. Anybody have something besides fiery serpents in verse, what is it? Ma'am? Ooh, I like that. That's interesting. Anything else? Fiery serpents is probably the most common. One of the challenges about this is because the Hebrew, and again, I am not a Hebrew scholar, but the Hebrew actually uses the word seraphim snakes. Now, seraphim was the word for a heavenly or angelic being. The seraphim covered their feet and their mouth, and with 2 wings they flew, with 2 wings they covered their mouth, 2 wings they covered their feet. They're generally associated with the throne and manifestations of God. And so to use the word seraphim in front of snakes gives scholars all these wild ideas. I'm sorry, I'm going to go with venomous snakes. I like that one. Fiery is probably closer to the meaning of the term, but when you get down to it, it's very difficult to concretely define exactly what this is, because the language is rather curious. It says, the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people. They bit the people, and many of the people of Israel died. Now, how many people in here love snakes? Where's David Campbell? He's not in here. Ray, you love snakes. Okay, anybody else love snakes? You like snakes? Well, I know they're good snakes, but for me the definition of a good snake is different than yours. Because mine is a dead snake. That's a good snake. Although I've learned to recognize rat snakes, and I do leave them because they do some good. And if I ever see a king snake, I'm planning on leaving that alone because they kill rattlesnakes. I'm really good with that. But, yeah, beyond that, end of a barrel, yeah, that's a good snake. So, just total transparency here. How's that? They bit the people, and many of the people of Israel died. Let me tell you this story, give you an idea of just how wonderfully I love snakes. We had just moved to Midlothian. Amanda's a baby. And it was time for me. We moved our mobile home down there to the piece of land we bought. And, of course, for a couple of months, you don't ever get it finished. And finally, okay, I got to get the skirting up. So I go out to the skirting that I took down very carefully in town, go out to the pile of metal that you put up around the bottom of the mobile home. And I'm thinking, you know, this is really not a good place to do this. So I take a hoe and pulling up one piece after another. And sure enough, about 3 pieces in, there's a snake. And it looked huge. So I go running inside and I get a shotgun, because that's what you do with snakes. Sorry. Come back out, peel it back again, see the snake, and I put a hole through about 6 pieces of skirting. But I got the snake. I'm just not a snake fan. Okay. Don't tell David I said that. David gets mad when I kill a snake. Okay. The people came to Moses, verse 7, and said, "We have sinned. We have spoken against the Lord and against you." Now, here's where I'll at least give this new generation a little credit. The older generation was pretty stubborn and was not in any hurry to admit their sin. This one, as soon as the people start getting bit, they go, "Oh, yeah." And they turn and they confess their sin. And I'm going to give them credit for that at least. It says, "We have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he take away the serpents from us." So Moses prayed for the people. Now, read the next couple of verses carefully and see if you can figure out what question I'm going to ask you. Verse 8, "The Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent, set it on a pole. It shall be that everyone who is bitten when he looks at it shall live. So Moses made a bronze serpent, put it on a pole, and so it was, if a serpent had bitten anyone, when he looked at the bronze serpent, he lived." Anybody recognize the question I've got about that text? Okay, Barbara.
To me, that would be just like setting up an idol, in the people's minds, because the snake would be the one, the snake on the pole would be the one who cured them.
Now you're getting ahead of the story. Don't do that. Right? Give me the
The
question.
reason why it's in italics this time?
Anytime you see in your translation italics, that means that it is filling in a word that the Hebrew or Greek doesn't actually have in the text.
So it's changed since the
It just
earlier-
uses the word seraphim there. But the implication is it's the same thing. And we know from other places in Scripture that speak about this same thing, that it is a serpent. So, why the difference? I have no idea. Other than, here's how God answered it. And he's, go ahead.
different fonts.
Because you're talking about serpent in verse, yeah. Now, yours says, which one is in italics?
The second one.
The second one, right. So here it says, make a seraphim. It doesn't use the word serpent there. It's not expressly, the word isn't there in the Hebrew. The translators fill it in because they've already been described as fiery serpents back in verse 6, right? And there it uses both words, seraphim and whatever the word is for serpent in Hebrew, I forget. So it uses both words there. Down here, when God's instructing Moses, he doesn't bother to fill in that word. He just says, make a fiery, and the implication is, you know what I'm talking about. Elsewhere, we learn, because Moses does make a bronze serpent, verse 9. So, that's why the translators fill that word in. But if it's in italics, it's not specifically in the Hebrew at that point in the text.
Are there examples of them using those expressions in their language?
Fiery serpent?
Implying
Yes.
the noun.
Yes. I could give you.
Our language, doesn't it?
It seems odd in our language. Let's see if I can work this out. I watched a white pickup drive into the parking lot. Get out. Oh, you mean that one? No, the white one. You wouldn't have to say truck again or pickup again. You don't always have to repeat it. That's all that's going on here. And we have other examples in Scripture, but off the top of my head, I'm drawing a blank. I'm more familiar with the ones in Greek, so the ones in the New Testament, and I'm sure given a few moments and no senior moments, I could take you to a dozen of them. But that kind of fills it out.
Was Moses the one that had to make it, or was he Moses to direct someone in the group of people to make this?
It says Moses made it.
I'm assuming Moses had to physically make this.
Yes, and if you watch the Chosen series, it already answers that question. Moses, one of the episodes starts with him making the serpent. So, but again, as far as we can tell, Moses had to make this one. And so I'm assuming God knows why. Nobody's got the question I want that this text leaves open. Okay, Sherry.
I don't know what your question is, but my question is, how tall was that pole and how big was that snake? Because there's millions of people. How are they all going to see that one object and all of that?
You're right. That's a great question, and I don't have an answer for that one. Doesn't tell us. But no, that's not my question. Now you've given me a whole new question I'm going to ponder over. Anybody? What did the people ask Moses to pray? Take away the snakes. What does the text leave unanswered? Did he take away the snakes? There's nothing in the text. The New King James chooses to translate it, if a certain serpent had bitten anyone, but a lot of the other translations do not, because that may or may not be the proper tense. It sounds like God said, no, I'm not going to take away the snakes, but I'm going to provide you a cure. And so it would seem it's ongoing. Again, if it's not great, but I do find that curious. Now, as to the idol, turn to John 3, just for a minute. Why would God have them put a snake on a pole? Well, if for no other reason, actually there's probably a couple of reasons, but for me this is the biggest. And remember, this will be 12, 13, 1400 years in the future. John chapter 3 opens with Jesus interacting with whom? Nicodemus, very important individual in John's account. Jump down to verse 14. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. That's the lead-in to our best-known verse. You've got 15 and then 16 after that. That's the lead-in. So one of the reasons, and again in my mind because it deals with Jesus, the most important reason, is this is symbolic, portraying the future where God would provide his ultimate salvation. Now, another reason is very likely that this was a requirement from God of the people, yes, I will save you, yes, I will heal you if. So now we've got conditional. Not all of his promises are conditional. His promise to Abraham was not conditional, but his promise in the Old Covenant given at Sinai was, by and large, conditional. If you will, then I will. And that's steady. Well, here it's being reinforced. They've sinned. God sends the consequence. And as far as the text goes, it doesn't tell us he ever removes the consequence, at least while they're in this region. But he provides a solution if you'll look at the pole. Now, it was very likely a very repugnant thing for the people to look at, in part because a lot of us hate snakes, and in part because, as I understand it, the worship of snake deities was a part of the idolatry that went on in that part of the world. I can't remember the peoples who especially celebrated the snake as one of their deities, but that would have represented idolatry. So that goes back to your question, right? Interestingly, and I can't remember where it happens, but I believe it's Hezekiah, King Hezekiah, so we're talking way on down the road. I think it's in 2 Kings. Way on down the road in her history, has to take that bronze serpent and have it destroyed because the people had begun to worship it, and it became an idol, and they were giving into idolatry. And so he destroyed this very thing that God created for good, the people had turned into an idol, and that made it evil, had to be destroyed. But I'm glad you asked that question. But nobody got my question until I asked it, right? Then you knew what I was talking about. Okay. And I'm going to finish this chapter, Lord willing. We'll see what we do with Balaam. But Balaam is one of my favorite stories. So chapters 22 through 25. And again, remember, Numbers is covering a period of roughly 40 years. And yet, many times, it will spend an extended period of time on a very short section of the story. So there's a lot of their journey for 40 years we just flat don't have. Or we have it referred to in summary fashion by locations that, quite honestly, we can't identify most of those on a map. Archaeology has not provided the answers to many of the locations. Okay. Verse 10, the children of Israel moved on and camped in Oboth, journeyed from Oboth, camped at Ije Abarim. You ought to try and pronounce some of these words. In the wilderness, which is east of Moab. So now, back right to your air map. East of Moab, they've finally gone from the coast of the north point of the, I think it's the Aegean Sea, whatever sea that, Gulf of Aqaba. Anyway, they've gone from there to the southern part of the Dead Sea is right here. This is the region of Moab. Edom is just down below it. They've gone around Edom because they wouldn't let them pass. And now they've come to the southern part of Moab. So you're down about the southern end of the Dead Sea and a little east of that. And now they're continuing to move. They're continuing to journey farther north. Let's see. From there they moved, camped on the other side of the Arnon, which is in the wilderness that extends from the border of the Amorites. For the Arnon is the border of Moab, between Moab and the Amorites. Therefore it is said. I'm not even going to go into these poetic expressions. The one that's recorded in verses 14 and 15, the Hebrew is even very obscure. And so there is a huge question mark about the best way to translate it, and trying to find a way to apply it is very difficult. Other than, this is letting us know that they had other written material, other records as a part of their culture, Israel does, that are not included in the inspired scriptures. So you've got this reference to the brooks of Arnon, lies on the border of Moab. The only connection is because that's identifying, again, the geographical area. Verse 16, there they went to Beer, which is the well. Beer means well, which is the well where the Lord said to Moses, gather the people together, and I will give them water. Then you've got another short song that's recorded for us. This one's not much easier, but it does say, the well the leaders sank, dug by the nation's nobles, by the lawgiver. In other words, Moses was one of the ones who dug the well using their staves. Then they go to Matana, to Nahaliel, Bamoth, in the valley that is in the country of Moab, to the top of Pisgah, which looks down on the wasteland. Now, Pisgah will show up again in a couple of chapters. It's a high region, the mount. It's a mount that gives you a significant view of the Promised Land area, as well as all the land around it. Then you've got two battles in short order. You've got Sihon, the king of the Amorites, verse 21. They try and get permission to pass through the land. Sihon says no, and instead he gathers, verse 23, gathers all his people together, went out against Israel in the wilderness. He came to Jahaz, fought against Israel. Israel defeated him with the edge of the sword, took possession of his land, and so forth. So you've got this the first destruction. Now Sihon and Og will be symbolic later in the Old Testament for a couple of prophetic messages. So their story is pretty short. I mean, they're pretty summarized, especially Og. But anytime you see Sihon and Og, they're looking back to this passage in Numbers 21 where Israel's victories have begun. First over the Canaanites, now over King Sihon, and again they develop a proverbial saying, and you can read through this on your own. Verse 31, thus Israel dwelt in the land of the Amorites. Then Moses sent to spy out Jazer. They took its villages, drove out the Amorites who were there. They are steadily moving up the east side of the River Jordan until they reach the northernmost point, which is straight across from Jericho. And that will be their staging area. They'll stay there all the way through the book of Deuteronomy until the beginning of Joshua. So we're almost to their last geographical location, and that's where they will sit until we get all the way through the book of Deuteronomy. They turned it and went up, verse 33, went up by the way to Bashan. So Og, king of Bashan, went out against them, he and all his people, to battle at Edrei. So again, the kings are instigating the fight, not Israel. The Lord said to Moses, do not fear, for I have delivered him into your hand with all his people and his land. You shall do to him as you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who dwelt at Heshbon. So they defeated him, his sons, and all his people, until there was no survivor left him, and they took possession of his land. So, again, this wasn't part of the actual promised land. It was supposed to be from the Jordan west. There, God's actually giving them, we're going to say, more than what they had a reason to expect. And for 2.5 tribes, this land that they're conquering on the east side of the Jordan, that's where they're going to stay. To the point that when Israel as a nation gets ready to go into the Promised Land, cross the Jordan River, go into the Promised Land and begin the conquest, there's friction because these 2.5 tribes are reluctant to send any warriors with them. And that was part of the deal. God said Israel would do this. So if these 2.5 tribes didn't send any warriors, you're taking, what's 2.5 out of 12? I don't know. If somebody was here who did math, Susan, she would be able to answer that for me. But anyway, what percentage that is, 25% or something like that, because 3 out of 12 is 25%. That would take 25% out of it, and Israel would be disobeying God because she was not fighting as a whole. So what they'll wind up doing, and I'm getting ahead of the story, but I'm just letting you know, is they'll leave their wives, their children, and some to guard their homes, and the warrior body, that all of those who are cleared for battle, they'll accompany Israel across the Jordan and into the conquest. So they'll be there for 2 years, or give or take.
The victories that this generation, as you said, seems to be more understanding that it's God that is providing these victories. It's not what the people per se have done, but what God is doing through their obedience and dedication to God and following maybe His statutes that are there at this time, possibly making a change or a transition from their forefathers.
They are, and they're also having to learn war on their own. Because remember, the victories that they had already won were won primarily by the last generation. You didn't start to fight until you were 20 years of age or older. Well, everybody 20 years or older had to die. This is a brand new generation. Few, if any of them, have any battle experience. And yet they're able to go out, and God hands them 1, 2, 3 victories, just bang, bang, bang. They're meshing into a cohesive unit, and not so much tribal division at this point. That's an important part of preparing them for the battle to come.
Winning 3 battles in a row would be confidence building.
It is confidence building, yes. And they're finally getting, one of the things I find really interesting is it's right on the heels of them complaining against God and God punishing them, and yet turn around and here's the victories, and they're remarkable victories. And Israel finally has gained possession of some of the land. And so on the heels of that sin, this new generation, God says, I'm taking you in and we're going to accomplish this anyway. And bang, bang, you've got these victories. They take the cities, they wipe out the inhabitants, just the way God instructed, to the point that verse 35, it says, they defeated him, King Og, and killed all his people. There were no survivors left. Same thing going on with Sion. Took them out. So they're already starting their obedience to God in punishing these cultures, these nations, as God instructed. Had they continued that when they entered the promised land, they would have had very greatly reduced problems in the future, had they continued that. Now, lest we think that they are totally perfect, you get chapters 22, 23, 24, and 25. Long section. We know the beginning of the story. We learned that in kids' school, and we'll get there. Look at chapter 25 right quick. I just want you to see how this verse starts. Israel is fresh on the heels of already wiping out 2 of these peoples that God had condemned to destruction. They're right on the heels of being victorious. They come up against the Midianites and the Moabites. That's Balak and his people. They come up against them. Balak is terrified of Israel. He knows they can't be beat on the battlefield because their God has triumphed over all the other deities so far, defending the other lands. He tries something sneaky. It backfires, and he's not happy, but he is still successful. Look at chapter 25, verses 1 and 2 at least. It says, Israel remained in Acacia Grove, and the people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. They invited the people to the sacrifices of their God, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel was joined to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel. So this will be the first adversary they come up against that is marginally successful against Israel. Primarily because he doesn't try and go at it attacking. He doesn't try and go at it militarily. He tries to go at it spiritually first, which is what the chapters in between are, and that's going to turn into a great big fail. But then he goes at it a different way and is somewhat successful. Now, let's see. I'm not going to read all this to you. What time is it? Okay, we've got a few minutes. Let's set the stage. Balak, he's heard what Israel's done, probably to the Canaanites. He's heard what Israel's done, certainly to Sihon and then Og, and how Israel's just come in like grasshoppers and mowed them down and cleaned them out and claimed their land. So Balak, the king of Moab, he is rightfully terrified because, you know what? Israel's just unstoppable. And in their world, when one nation defeats another nation, that means the God of this nation is superior to the God of that nation. And that was common in the pagan world. Israel will encounter that time and again, and at times it's going to be a stumbling block for her. So in Balak and the people of Balak, in his mind, we can't do anything successfully against Israel until we can get their God out of the way. And so they send to hire a sorcerer, diviner. He appears multiple times in the scriptures, and almost every time a different aspect of his character and his practices is revealed. I'm pretty sure, I have not read, I can't find where I remember studying this, but I'm fairly certain that Balaam is at the heart I believe it's a necromancer who you kill the animals and then you take their internal organs and you divine messages from the internal organs. At least that seems to be a part. Now what we do know about Balaam is he was a very famous sorcerer / diviner in the ancient world. We found more than one archaeological reference to Balaam what's he called? Balaam the son of Beor. There have been multiple archaeological discoveries of his name in official records. And so Balaam was a big deal. He was an up-and-comer in his world. And we're talking about a well-known over a large region, because they send to Balaam, and he's got to travel, I think it's about 400 miles. It's either 200 miles one way or 400 miles and 400 round trip, either way. But he's got to travel an exceeding distance from where he starts out, where they beckon him to get to Balak. And so he's known over a tremendous region. He won't be known after chapter 31, at least not alive. But we'll get to that. So they send for this guy. He's well known. They offer him all this wealth to come down and curse Israel so that maybe you can get Israel's God to stop his protection. The saying was to remove his shadow over Israel. And maybe then Moab and Midian have a chance. Let's see. Drop down to verse 5. He sent messengers, I'm in 22:5. He sent messengers to Balaam, the son of Beor, at Pethor, which is near the river in the land of the sons of his people, to call him, saying, Look, a people has come from Egypt. See, they cover the face of the earth and are settling next to me. Therefore, please, come at once. Curse this people for me, for they are too mighty for me. Perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them out of the land. For I know that he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed. Interesting language right there. When God bestows his blessing on Abraham, there's a similar thought. Whoever blesses Israel will be blessed by God. Don't know if there's any relation between the two, but I do find that curious. Verse 7, the elders of Moab and the elders of Midian depart with the diviner's fee in their hand. They came to Balaam and spoke to him the words of Balak. Has the first bell rang yet? Yes? Okay. let's stop here because this is a really good story and it's a shame to break it up. And it's a really good story. If you haven't read this lately, we're going to try and cover all 3 chapters next week. You might read ahead for class, but I don't want to break it up there. So.